Hi all, thank you for joining us for this webinar on the proposed tax residency changes in Australia and how they'll impact upon those who are resident in Hong Kong but travel to Australia for business and for pleasure. You will have noticed that both this is a recorded webinar and a link will be sent out to you following the webinar so that you can re-access the content at a time and pace of your leisure. Also that you've all been placed on mute. We would encourage you to use the chat function if you have any questions, as this webinar is for your benefit, and we will come to those in due course. I would also like to note that this is for educational purposes only. This session will not constitute financial or tax advice. Thank you for joining us. I'm Yusuf Murphy from the Northland Group, the preeminent administrator and establisher of foreign superannuation funds for those who are repatriating or emigrating to Australia. And I'm joined today by Matthew Jones. Matthew's a senior wealth advisor at Oreana Private Wealth. He specializes in delivering comprehensive financial advice for expatriates throughout Asia and for those relocating or returning to Australia. Dual licensed in both Australia and Hong Kong, and backed by an extensive technical background, Matthew provides goal-focused strategic advice for clients of all circumstance. Matthew has over 10 years of experience in financial services and offers an in-depth knowledge of all facets of advisory, including wealth creation, risk management, superannuation, tax planning, and succession planning strategies to individuals and families. He's authorized under Oreana's Australian Financial Services License, as well as being accredited with the SFC in Hong Kong. And as a starting point, before we go into the specific implications of the proposed tax residency implications for a Hong Kong resident, perhaps we could take a step back and look at the Australian tax residency rules as they've been proposed. We've prepared a short PowerPoint illustrating those changes. Matthew, could you take us through them, please?
Sure. Thanks, Yusuf. Thank you all for joining as well. So I guess to begin with, as Yusuf brings up the slides, a bit of context behind the proposals as they are at the moment. The announcement was in the recent federal budget in May this year. However, it's based on a paper that was released by the Tax Board in 2019. Now, basically, the current residency rules are driven by the intention of returning to Australia and spending time in Australia, which obviously leaves a lot of a grey area. And there's a lot of areas that are driven by private rulings and a lot of uncertainty around this. So essentially a bright line test, which this is now based on, number of days per year, was in some ways welcomed. But yeah, I guess as the saying goes, the devil is in the detail here. So the current proposals are based less around the intention and now more on your ties to Australia, as well as a combination of days spent. So the first test, there are two tests essentially. The first one is based on basically half of the year. So 183 days or more in Australia during the course of an income year, which is basically financial year from 1 July to June 30. If you're spending more than half of the year in Australia, you're going to be considered an Australian tax resident. Now, that's one of the current tests that are in place, so that's nothing new. If you're spending less than 183 days in Australia, there is now a second test that they're introducing, which is proposed to eliminate a lot of this uncertainty. So there's a quick check whether you're a government official deployed overseas on foreign service, which would mean that you are still a resident for tax purposes. But less than 183 days, there is a second factor test. Yusuf, if you'd like to move forward, please. So the second test essentially is if you're spending less than 183 days in Australia, they then look at whether you're spending 45 days or more. It's now that and a combination of a 4-factor test, of which you only need to meet 2. Essentially, these tests are the first being the right to reside permanently in Australia. Now, essentially that's all citizens, so it covers all Australian expats, and essentially pretty much anyone that's not on a temporary visa, tourist visa in Australia. So that's pretty broad reaching. The second test is Australian accommodation. Now, that is essentially any accommodation that may be available to you or readily available to you upon your return. That may be a property that's left empty for your use. It may be a property that's rented with your belongings and your furniture and everything in it that is available upon your return. It's not meant to mean, you know, mum and dad, but there is an example in the tax paper that does go to include, for instance, granny flats. So if you've got children and they've got space available for you upon your return, that's going to meet that second factor test. The third one is Australian family. So that goes to include spouse and dependent children, so under the age of 18 specifically. If they are residing in Australia permanently, this would also extend then to yourself if you're living offshore to meet that third factor test. And fourth is the Australian economic interests. And again, this is probably the most broad-reaching or second most broad-reaching of the four. Now, that is the two main items that they list there are real property. So if you own a home or a rental property in Australia, you're going to meet that test. And the next one is substantial economic interest. So that can be basically is to consider cash. Again, substantial is not defined as such in the paper. So we may see some more guidance around that, but you could probably expect sort of, you know, 50,000 or above to be included there. It does fortunately stop short of including superannuation. It's not meant to include superannuation, and also shares are also meant to be excluded in this as well. So if you do meet, if you are spending 45 days and meet two of these four factor tests, you will unfortunately be deemed an Australian tax resident. Yusuf, if you'd like to move to the next one. So included in the tax paper is our rules around ceasing your Australian residency as well. Now, it really guides around the overseas employment rule. Now, basically, this is a number of factors here that are included. This, the first being residing in Australia for the 3 prior income years, and being employed with an overseas employment period of over 2 years from commencement is quite important. Having accommodation available for the entire employment period that you're intending to be posted or permanently moving overseas. And then obviously spending less than 45 days in Australia in each of the income years of that employment. Otherwise, you will revert back to these the current residency proposed rules. So if you do meet all of those, and you do need to meet all of those, you can be considered a non-resident for tax purposes from the day of departure. If it's a no for any of those, we then need to move to the other residency rules that they are now proposing as well. Yusuf, if you'd like to skip forward. So there's 2 residency tests here, and one's based on short-term ceasing residency and longer term. So a short-term residency would probably include an expat that may have got caught up in these new proposed residency rules, or you've returned for a year and then you're going to return overseas again. So what they look at here is essentially, did you spend 45 days and the 2-factor test? So essentially, you may meet it 1 year, but as long as you can you're not spending time over 45 days, or you're not meeting the combination of the two proposals, you can be considered a non-resident again from the day that you're leaving Australia. If that's a no, again, you're going to be once again deemed an Australian tax resident. And then moving to the longer term residency test. So this is for basically you're essentially moving overseas for a posting or for the first time. Now, it's essentially becoming more difficult to break those ties and now become deemed as a non-resident for tax purposes. So if you're leaving under the employment rule from the previous slide, it's obvious that you are going for a period, or intended to go for a period of more than 2 years. You've got accommodation, and it's clear that you are relocating overseas. In the instance where you're not relocating overseas under the employment rule, now this may include for a long-term sabbatical, older Australians or Australians looking to retire overseas. Without that employment rule, or guiding by the employment rule, it is now more difficult to become a non-resident for tax purposes from the day you leave. Essentially, they're going to look at, did you spend 45 days in Australia over the last 2 previous income years? If it's yes, then you're going to be a non-resident and continue to be a non-resident. So essentially, if you're not leaving under the employment rule, you can expect to be deemed an Australian resident for at least 2 to 3 years before then being considered a non-resident again, or for the first time. Look, that's pretty much it. That's the proposals there. As mentioned, the devil is in the detail here. So I think Yusuf's prepared a few questions here, and we're probably just going to have a bit of back and forth and then open up to questions that are coming through online.
We are indeed. Thanks for walking us through that, Matthew. One of the things that jumps out is this is all about testing whether you're going to become Australian tax resident in that particular year. What are the implications as a Hong Kong resident to then also being deemed an Australian tax resident for that year?
Yeah, so unfortunately, the Aussie expats have probably got the stick here among a lot of the countries that do have a double tax agreement in place. A lot of countries such as Singapore, New Zealand, US have double tax agreements in place, which basically can go towards a tiebreaker test and avoiding some of these basically being deemed a tax resident across 2 countries. In Hong Kong, there is no double tax agreement with Australia. So what that means is if you are meeting these new factor tests that are being introduced, you're then subject to Australian tax rules, which, as a lot of us may know, includes worldwide tax on income and capital gains at a lot higher rate than what we're subject to currently here in Hong Kong.
Would I be right in assuming, because there isn't that double taxation agreement between Hong Kong and Australia, that the income that you're receiving in Hong Kong, which could be taxable, so your remuneration from your employment, for example, would then also be subject to Australia without an offset?
Yeah, that's right. So again, without the benefit of that double tax agreement, essentially that's what it's introduced to do, to avoid instances where you can be considered a tax resident at the same time in 2 different countries. So yeah, unfortunately, this is something you really need to be mindful of around the time that you're spending in Australia, or end the economic ties that you do have to Australia as well.
And with the rules, I mean, there's a lot of reference to the number of days. Perhaps it might be a little remedial as a question, but how do they calculate days? Is that having to spend a full 24-hour period in country, or are partial days rounded up or rounded down? How does that work?
Yeah, it's a good question again. So essentially, they consider a day is considered pretty much from midnight on to midnight. So you could arrive at 11:50 p.m. The second that goes over midnight, you're going into a second day. So that's considered 2 days, even though that may be less than a 24-hour period.
Wow. As we've seen in Australia and many other places around the world, in response to COVID-19, a number of active measures are being taken, including introducing quarantine periods and mandatory lockdowns, which impact upon people's flights home. Are those taken into account when people are calculating the number of days in country?
Yeah, again, another good question. With the announcement, although it was this year at the federal budget, it's based on a paper that was written in 2019. So it was the pre-COVID world. So essentially, as the proposals, and they are only proposals at this point, are being tabled, it doesn't include any carve-outs for quarantines, getting delayed and stuck in countries. It doesn't include any provisions around any of that. So unfortunately, as it stands right now, it is strictly 45 days.
Okay, as you mentioned, the proposals kind of came in before COVID-19 became a reality for us all. For many years, Australian businesses have been expanding overseas and having key members of staff travel over to these new ventures and then come back into Australia, so board level positions. Are there any carve-outs for the expanding Australian businesses for their expatriated staff or board members to come back to Australia?
Yeah, again, that is a good question. Again, being employed by an Australian employer, you can look at then being considered in that fourth test, economic interests and ties. You're being paid from an Australian company. So again, you've really got to be careful around the 45 days and meeting any of these two other factors that are included. So again, it's really important to focus on the time that you're spending, and look, probably look speaking to your employer as well, to be more mindful around the time that you're going to be spending in Australia.
The next subject I wanted to come on to is one that I've seen a couple of questions pop up in the chat facility, so I'll throw mine at you and then we'll go through those two as well.
Sure.
With respect to the second of the factors, Australian accommodation. You kind of alluded to it when you were going through the PowerPoint, but I wanted to pull this one out specifically. What if the taxpayer has an informal arrangement with family members to stay in a particular accommodation when they return to Australia? Would that be sufficient to tick that box?
Yeah, look, probably it is. It's going to meet the second factor there around accommodation being available. Informal arrangements, as I mentioned, there was an example actually included specifically around a granny fat being available for parents returning. That is going to meet that accommodation factor being available. With the inverse of having accommodation rented and you owning it, you're going to meet number 4 of having economic interest in Australia.
Okay. And from the chat facility, Joe has asked, what if you own and rent property vacant of your belongings? So if you're renting out a property in Australia that you own, but you don't have your property, so it's unfurnished, for example, and perhaps I could expand that a little by asking, is there a minimum tenancy that it needs to be rented out for in order to not be available for your use?
Yeah, so again, they're sort of covering both bases here. If you have substantial economic interests, and again, they have specifically included rural property. If you own real property in Australia, that's going to meet that fourth factor of having an economic interest in Australia. So even without your belongings and you own the property, that's going to meet number 4 there.
Okay, and I think I may be able to see the answer coming. But the other question we got was with respect to investment property. So an investment property that you own in Australia that's leased out, would that be considered available for use? Does it need to be empty? Does that trigger 0.4 or or factor 4?
Yeah, it is. It's going to be the ownership. So look, that can be considered. I mean, if you own a vacant block of land, it's not rented, it's not producing income. The ownership of that economic interest is going to meet that fourth factor test.
Okay, very clear. Unfortunately, we've seen that a number of the organised groups like AusCham that represent the Australian diaspora have been making representations back to Canberra on the implications of these rules that they see for their members. Do we have any visibility yet on what impact, if any, that's having on the proposed final rules?
Yeah, so look, there is a process of consultation that the proposals need to go through first. Then they will then go through royal assent, which is basically the proposals becoming legislation. And then it is it's intended then to come in the following financial year from 1 July. So stepping back a few steps there, that process of consultation is where representations and inquiries are all included into, as mentioned, the consultation process before it is then legislated or proposed to be legislated. It's not actually at that consultation process, as far as I understand. So it's hard to probably comment on what impact this is having yet. But there are plenty of vocal groups in the expat community, as you can imagine, AusCham being one. So yeah, it'll be interesting to see what impact they do have.
Okay, and this kind of plays on from that particular point. Clearly the rules didn't come into effect yet, and we've just hit July 1st for this year. So they're not going to come into effect for this financial year. Do you have any visibility or perhaps best guess on when we should be foreseeing these coming into effect?
Yeah, look, it's $1 million question, isn't it? Look, a lot of reputable tax specialists are very much expectant that this will come in from 1 July 2022, which is basically the next financial year. As mentioned, these proposals weren't intended for a COVID environment, so it may be delayed as well to potentially a point where there's no quarantine facilities. But the fact that it was announced in the recent federal budget, I think the intention's quite clear that the Australian government is keen to bring this in, or the ATO is keen to bring this in to eliminate all of this grey area as soon as possible. So it may be the fact that this goes through with a lot of support. We may see this as early as 1 July 2022, and maybe potential nuances around what's included in those 45 days. So maybe there will be a carve out around the quarantine periods, etc.
We've had a question come in which extends that some. Are you aware currently under the proposals of any proposed exemptions? For example, for compassionate grounds, you have a sick relative back in Australia, you travel over to look after them for a period of time. Are there any exemptions from these rules being applied, or is it at present, before we see the results of this consultation, thick line, it's 45 days, yay or nay?
Yeah, it's a bit of an interesting one. There were provisions around the 183-day rule. So basically half of the year, if there's an unforeseeable event, and one of the examples they used in the paper, I think, was a volcano erupting and you couldn't fly out, and you happen to go over that 183 days. There is some leeway around that. However, the 45 days that they've stated that you would then have to, that you would then be subject to, there's no leeway around that. Unfortunately, there are no carve-outs again around compassionate grounds. So it is unfortunately quite straightforward around the 45.
Okay, we've had two questions come in, both asking a similar question. When these rules do come into effect, whether 1 July 2022 or 1 July 2023, would they be applying retrospectively or would they only be forward-looking?
Yeah, it was specifically stated that the intention is not to look back retrospectively. Again, nothing is certain here and until it is through its actual legislation, but the intention has been stated that it is not intended to be retrospective once it does come into play.
Okay, and kind of leading on from that, are there actions or steps that potentially exposed taxpayers could look at taking now in preparation for these rules coming in?
Yeah, look, there's a couple of guys on the line here that might be first port of call, but look, timing and making sure you're well prepared. There are a range of strategies available, either offshore as an expat prior to becoming an Australian tax resident. And also there's a range of strategies onshore in Australia that the current Australian tax residents implement to mitigate their taxation obligations. But if you are looking at considerable amount of assets, you're looking to either restructure, sell, these things do take time. So the intention's there. I think it is quite clear that these are intended to come into play sooner rather than later. So it is about getting on the front foot.
So I could ask a slightly broader question from this specific area. When you're talking with clients, what are kind of the principal areas that you encourage them to include in their repatriation plan?
Yeah, again, I think it's probably thinking about the options that are available. The first one is around obviously being mindful of the time you're spending in Australia. That's the obvious one here. The second one is around, again, as I touched on, structuring opportunities available as onshore. You can utilise superannuation. There are a range of strategies available. The third one there, and I guess we haven't touched on it yet, is potentially considering cutting your ties or economic ties to Australia as well. Retirees, for instance, or that are not looking to come back to Australia permanently, and you want to move around Europe or Asia, and less of an intention to own property, for instance, in Australia. It may be an easier decision to essentially cut those economic ties, and then you won't be meeting those factor tests.
Interesting thought. That gets to the end of the questions that I've prepared. If anyone else has any questions, please feel free to submit them now. We'll give you a minute for those questions to come through before we close up. And just while we're waiting on those questions, perhaps I'll throw one more to you, Matt. You were talking about kind of severing those links back to Australia, and one of the potential ways of doing that was selling property back in Australia. Are there other concrete measures that someone would have to take like that in order to sever that linkage?
Yeah, I mean, again, it's those economic ties that they're looking at. These are to, rather than looking at the intention, looking at those ties. So yeah, again, considering whether to sell property, there are other potential implications there. As we know, the capital gains exemption for residential property was removed recently. So while it might sound easy, there are a lot of a bit of a minefield of tax implications you do need to think about. And look, the best way forward there is to really speak to tax specialists to understand your current tax status and potential implications. And then there's planning steps around that to mitigate that.
Okay, thank you very much, Matt. Just looking to the chat, I think some of the questions were with respect to selling property. I've just gone through again. So unless there's any final questions coming through, I'd like to thank you all for your time and for the questions, and for Matt for sharing your experience and your expertise with respect to these proposed rules. What I'd suggest is, as Matt was saying, that we're going to be entering a period of consultation. Canberra is going to be taking note of the representations made by expatriated bodies and others. And during that consultation, we'll start to see with a sharper lens what exactly is going to come in those final rules. So perhaps when that comes into more clarity, we can schedule another session like this to give more concrete answers to some of the specific questions that have come up. I'd like to thank you for your time. Please note on the screen the contact details of the speakers, who will both be very happy to speak with you about the specifics of your circumstance should you wish to reach out. With that, I'd like to thank you, Matt, for your insights and wish you all a good day. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.